Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com and welcome to the third in our series of videos going over how to make a full stack application with Koa. So in our last video, we created our server object that is listening on port 1985. Now I just want to add one thing to that. So before we just had it where we were pointing out the port, but just so you know the full functionality of the listen function, you can actually pass three parameters. So the first parameter is always the port. So in this case, we're using 1985. Why? Because it's my birth year. It could literally be any number. You generally stay out of the numbers in the first 100 because those are things that a lot of other internet stuff uses. And when you eventually deploy this, particularly on Heroku, you'll be using 5000 because it's what Heroku uses. But for now, we're going to use 1985 in your local production environment or whatever number you want. And the second parameter is your server or your host. Okay, so in this case, we're doing it on our local computer. So we're going to use the term local host. We're going to get rid of these second two parameters before we go to production, since they'll default to what they need to be defaulted to come production. But what was important to me was to be able to have this third parameter. The third parameter takes a function. So if you want something to happen the minute your server starts, you can put it here. I usually just like to have some sort of little, hey, look, I'm listening kind of thing, just so that way I know that the server's working. It just kind of helps me to know what's going on in the program. You always want to be console logging stuff throughout your software as you're creating it, so that way you can kind of, when there's errors, you can see how much of your software has actually run, because it gives you little messages like this happened, that happened. Stuff that normally wouldn't print stuff out allows you just at least know where your software is kind of getting into a bottleneck. Makes life a lot easier. Okay, so listening on port 1980. So basically, once I start the server, it's just going to print to the screen, I'm listening on port 1985. Just that way I know. Okay, because otherwise it just kind of blinks the cursor. So if I were to kickstart node index.js, okay, not again, it's not a function. Okay, yeah, I have to play with that. We'll come back to that. We didn't finish that. Okay, but anyways, other things we're going to be doing today is one, we're going to be creating our, so I'm actually comment out the route stuff for now. So let me do that. And you can always comment stuff out quickly, which is a really useful feature on any of these text editors by hitting Control/. And then it just automatically adds a comment to it. So that way you can uncomment it out later. Okay, first thing I want to do today is create our static folder. So that's this code right here. This is just comments. So this doesn't really count for anything. It's just there to help make this a little bit more visible and pretty for you. So we're going to create what's called a static folder. A static folder is the folder where Koa will look for, like basically when a request comes in, and let's say someone types in like, I'm looking for xyz.html. It's going to go look in this folder. So basically the public can type in the URL and access any of the files in this folder. And it's static. They're not dynamically created, they're just static folders. So here's where you're generally going to want to put your CSS files, your JavaScript files for the front end stuff. Usually the typical way you do it is you call it public. Okay, so first here we actually have to create our static object. So first you want to download the static library or package. So you would type in npm I koa static into your npm, into your, it could be on bash or in the Windows node module, however you want to do it. Just install koa static, kind of like you installed koa in the last video, npm I koa static, and now we need to bring it into our file. So we're going to call it static, just so that way it's clear that this is our static folder. So we're going to say const, make a constant called static, and we're going to require koa static. So now static is our static object that we can use to call all of the static functions. Now I generally like to create a section for my middleware. Okay, and again, middleware, what is middleware? Middleware is basically everything that happens between the request and the response. So essentially what's happening is that when someone types in your website URL, they are sending a request to your server. Your server is going to do stuff and then send a response. All the stuff that it does in between is the middleware. So anytime you see server.use or whatever you call your server, Okay, but .use, this is defining middleware, saying, okay, these are the things you need to do when a request comes in. Okay, so right now I have two things here. I'm actually going to comment out this one. We'll come back to that. Okay, and we're going to want to have two things. Or here we have one piece of middleware. So basically, again, our server will start listening. So when this program runs, it's going to read through our entire code, which is why we want the listener at the bottom, so that way it queues up all the middleware. And then here it begins listening, and then once request comes in, it'll run all that middleware and give the appropriate response. So in this case, right now, the only thing we have is this, server.use. So server.use means, hey, here's a piece of middleware. And then inside the parentheses for server.use is our middleware, but what it's going to do. Okay, so in this case, we're passing our static object, which means, hey, run static every time that a request comes in. And what static does, it says, hey, I'm going to go look in the static folder. So we have to tell it what the static folder is. So static takes a parameter of whatever folder you want. And you can make as many of these as you want. So you can make multiple static folders, and what it'll do is it'll look in each one for the file the user is looking for. It's probably easier just to have one and then create subfolders in that public folder. So that's what I usually would do. So basically, okay, so we have our public folder, and what I would do here is I would just create a bunch of folders for the files I would need. So like CSS files. Oh, I don't want to create that in there. Escape. I want to do that in the public folder. So I would want to create like a JS file for any JavaScript files on the front end. So not the JavaScript here that I'm doing on the back end through Node, but it's like the JavaScript files with jQuery where I'm going to play with what's going on the website. And of course, a images file for any images that we use throughout. So now I have those files and they're accessible. Now what I did do is create a text.txt that says this is a test file. So we're going to try the test out to see if the static file is working, or static folder is working. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to queue up our server. So I commented out all that route stuff just because that seemed to be interrupting the server for a moment. So I'm going to run the server. So I'm going to type in node index.js, our initial file. Oh, and it's still giving me a problem. route.get / context body. Again, I want to come back to that, but I thought I commented that out. Oh, that's great. It's very useful if you save your file before you do stuff, so that way it sees your changes. You'd be surprised how often that is the problem. Okay, you forgot to save, and you're thinking, why? I just fixed the error. Why is it still erroring? Okay, you kind of get in the habit of looking for these things. Okay, node.index.js, and see, it tells me I'm listening on port 1985. So this way I know it's working. Because otherwise it would just be that flashing line, which kind of tells you it's working, but, you know, this is just a little bit clear that your code's running, which just makes production that much easier. So let's go back to our browser, okay? Type in localhost, well, not local, I'm not using 8000 right now, 1985. Again, I have nothing in the main, so it says not found because it hadn't found anything. But since I have a public folder now, public folder is assumed to be the root, so that means anything starting with /. Okay, so I can just type in text.text. So it's going to go look in that public folder, and it finds our text file and prints it onto the screen. This is a test file. If you see the static folder is working, yay! So it works. So you can put anything in that static folder, and theoretically at this point, you could just create a traditional static website in that folder. You could just put your index.html in there, or your CSS files, and you have a server, and it's serving your static website. But in today's world, that's a little overkill just for that. You could just, deploy your website to Netlify or any host, and your static website's going. So the reason why you would want to build something with Koa and other kind of full stack frameworks is because you're going to want to do something a little bit more dynamic. Okay, so we're going to be learning how to make something more dynamic as we go on. Something that can pull data from a database, render it onto a screen, create templates, so that way what's in the HTML can be dynamic based on the data that we're using. These kind of really cool things. So, but, and then if someone wanted to access something in the CSS file, it would just be, slash CSS / whatever file / image So that public folder acts as your sort of root slash. Okay, so that's how the static folder works. So now that we have that set up, that's all good. Now we'll begin to get our routes set up. Okay, so the first step is to install Koa router. So you're going to type in npm I Koa router. So I'm going to uncomment this out. Okay, so I'm creating the route. So we installed the router, and I need to bring the router in. So just like before, I had to create a new variable to hold the object. So I'm going to call it route because I want, just to me, it's more semantic. Other people will use router, other people will use, I've seen someone just use a plain underscore, which I thought was an odd way of doing it, but you can call it whatever you want. But I'm going to say routes because each time I'm going to use it, it's really going to be an individual route. So route equals required Koa router. Now I need to add it to my middleware so that way Koa knows to look for it. Okay, so control. So this is what I'm saying is that every time a request comes in, it's going to run the middleware. So it's going to go look in the static folder for my, and actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the routes first because it runs them in order. And the reason I want to do that is just in case, let's say I create a route for the root and I wanted to send it to an index HTML that I'm going to have in somewhere else, not in the public folder, but I happen to have a index.html in the public folder. If it looks in the public folder first, then it might run that file, and that's why my route's not working. So sometimes the reason why your routes aren't doing what you want them to do is because some other step in your chain of middleware is responding first. Okay, so be cognizant of what order things are on as far as how your routes are going to be processed. This is going to be really important when we start discussing dynamic routes, where you can put parameters in your route, because that can oftentimes cause an issue and you're like, wait, I've created this route and it's sending it over here. Why is it sending it over here? It's because in the order that it looks. So be cognizant of that. Okay, so basically what this is saying, okay, oh, I see what's going on here. Okay, so we're ready to find our router over here. And, oh yeah, that routes actually. Okay, so what we're saying is that we're going to use another piece of middleware to be part of our route object that we created up here, and then the function inside that route object that we're invoking is routes, which means it's going to look for all the routes that we define throughout the program. So there's our piece of middleware. Let's save that. Routes.routes. Okay. Okay, just a minor correction on the setting up of the routes. So back over here where we created our routes, we're going to do it in 2 steps. So yes, we're going to pull in our router object from the Koa package. We actually have to create a new router. So basically do it this way, const router. So that's basically pulling in router from the package, but then we have to take that router object and create a new one. So const route equals new router. Okay, so I'll give you a second to get that set up. And then everything else is the same. So basically you will still do server.use route.routes. So that way that's our middleware. And then here, let's talk about how our routes are set up. So here I created a section for routes. And the reason I like to kind of break it off into sections just makes it easier to find my code. If I break it off, all my middlewares in my middleware section, my listeners and my listener, just breaks it up. It makes it easier for my code. As the code gets bigger and bigger and bigger, we're going to start breaking it up into multiple files. The typical structure you have is what's called MVC, models, views, controllers. And the way usually you do that is you just create a couple folders in your application, which are, we already have views. Views are going to be sort of your web pages. So anytime you have a website that we're going to send back to the user, we're going to put that in the views folder. And we're going to use a templating engine. In this particular exercise, it's Nunjux, but you can use Pug, you can use EJS. There's many more in Node that allows you to take data and implant it in a file. Okay, I've used EJS in the past. EJS is pretty good. This time we're going to use Nunjux just because I always like to try out new things as we do these exercises. But views is where all those full folders will go, and in the next video we'll discuss how the view setup works. Now later on, we're gonna install Mongo and create um, objects and data through Mongo that we're going to store in Mongo. Now the schema, which is going to be sort of the template for how that data is supposed to look like, is going to be stored in the models folder. Okay, so model views. And then all these routes we'll be creating, later on we'll move them into the controller file folder. Or we may not in this particular exercise, but usually you may want to have a folder called controller, and that should be actually over here. Yes, there we go. And because in this particular project, we're only going to really have one model, which is blog posts. Okay, we're creating a blog. But in the future, you might have lots of different models, lots of different types of data you're keeping track of. So you might have, so if you're creating a multi-user site, you're going to have, a model for users. Okay, and you're gonna have different routes for when people look up different users, and you're gonna have blog posts. So when the people look up blog posts, you're gonna have a different model for blog posts. On Facebook, every type of object, every time you have a picture, every time you have a post, every time you have a video, each of those are a different model, and they're gonna have their own views, basically the kind of websites you look at when you're looking up videos, posts, whatnot on Facebook. But that data that populates that view is going to have different models, so different saying, hey, this is the types of data that we need for video, this is the types of data that we need for users, and then you're going to have a different controller which says, hey, when anyone requests this user thing, send them this, take this user data and this user view and mix them together. So the controller is the one that kind of orchestrates. It's the maestro, essentially what we're doing here with the router. Okay, so that's what they mean by model view controller. Models the data and what the data is supposed to look like and how it's stored. Views is how it's displayed to the user, and the controller is what connects the two. It says, okay, this data goes to this view when this route is invoked. Cool. So we'll have those folders there for now, but that's what that is. Okay, so let's actually create a route. Okay, so the way a route gets made is you're going to call your server your route object. So in this case, I called it route. Okay, but you can call it whatever you want, depending on how you set up your code. And there's different verbs. These are HTTP verbs. There's like a whole bunch of them, but the only ones you're more than likely going to use most of the time are get, post, patch, put, and delete. And a lot of the times people only use get. Okay, get is generally for any time you're just sending something back. So someone says, hey, I want this website, and you're going to send it back to them, you use get. So basically, the person's just requesting to get something from you. The post is assuming like the user filled out a form, like they want to create a new blog post. They're going to fill out a form saying, hey, new blog post, this is what I want to say. And then they're going to hit submit on the form, and the form will submit a post request. And we'll create a route that takes that post request and actually creates a new blog post in the database. Okay, now again, none of these verbs do anything inherently. Okay, you have to define what each one does. So theoretically, you can just do everything with GET requests. It's just very sloppy and makes your code harder to read, because by using the right verb, it makes your code more readable. But I theoretically can manipulate. I can just make everything a bunch of GET requests, and say, hey, just do this, this, and this, and this. But it gets really sloppy really quick. So you want to make use of these verbs. Patch is generally when you only want to modify a part of the data. So let's say you have the user data and the person only wants to modify their password, you might use patch. Put is when you want to replace the entire data. So basically, generally if you're like editing a post, you're going to have a form that has your entire information in there, and you're just going to edit what you want, but it's going to resubmit the whole post. So that's a put. And delete, well, you're removing the post from the database. Okay, so generally, if you have all of these going on in your application, we call that CRUD. Okay, you have a fully CRUD featured application, which means C for create, you can create stuff. R for read, you can find the information and look at it. U, you can update the information, so you can change it if you need to. And D, you can delete the information. CRUD. Cool. Okay, route.get. So, okay, now to the route. So route.get, so route, we're saying, hey, our router object is going to process a GET request. The question is, when does it process this particular GET request? Well, you have to name an endpoint. So this is the endpoint. So in this case, this is our root, the slash. Okay, and it says anytime that someone calls the root, we're going to route them. And then you always, basically the second parameter is a function. So this is the second parameter, which I think I'm missing am I missing a parentheses? No, I'm not. Okay, so this is our second parameter. And it takes a function. You don't have to define the function through an arrow function in the parameter list. You could create a function somewhere else and then just plop it in there. You know, it just depends. Are you going to be really reusing that function again? If not, just define it in the parameter. So if you're not familiar with how an arrow function works, these are the parameters, kind of like any old function. Now, what happens is that the route function is going to pass two parameters to whatever function you do here. So any function you put in here, you want to make sure it's prepared to take two parameters. One is called context. Okay, this is, if you ever used Express, you used to have two parameters as well, but they were called request and response, which represented the information that was being sent with the request versus the information you're sending with the response. Okay. In Koa, we just mixed the request and response objects into one context object, which again, you can name your parameters whatever you want because these are just placeholders, but the convention is to always call the CTAX for context. And then this is next. Next, you really don't have to do anything with. That's kind of something that Koa does. Really what it is that in Koa, everything is middleware. Okay, basically everything is just a sequence of middleware that's running between your request and your response. So even your routes are middleware and are run in your middleware chain. So, and the way the middleware works, it's a chain. So basically at the end of each middleware, there has to be sort of a next saying, hey, go on to the next piece of middleware. So that way we can make sure that this route is handled correctly or this request is handled appropriately. So this just represents that next in line thing. Don't worry about that. Okay, now what if I just want to print out some words onto the screen? I would just type in context.body, and then I can put in what I put on the screen. You could put HTML here, so you could literally just render a whole website in your quotation marks, but that's not going to make your code look very pretty, and nor is it the easiest way of doing things. But you theoretically could. But here I'm just rendering the word hello world. So let's go start our server and try it out. So node index.js. Okay. Let's go over to Chrome. Okay. And now let's go to the root route. Hello world. So see, what happened is that we sent the request. Koa gets the request to this, because again, just localhost 985 is the same thing as if I just put a slash there, which means root because there's nothing after the slash. Because it's always host and then everything else is after the host. So it goes back and says, hey, we're going to return hello world, and that's that. And again, I still have my other route. I mean, I still have my static folder, so I could still just go text.txt and still access my text file. So you can start really building out a bunch of things that someone can do when they're accessing your website. Cool. So let's turn off our server. So to turn off our server, we're going to hit Control C. And you'll know it's off because it'll go turn back into a normal. There we go. So it goes back into a normal input on my terminal. So now if I were to go back here, it won't work. Site can't be reached because my server is off. It's no longer taking requests. With that, I'm going to end this video. I'll see you guys in the next one. We're going to start talking more about views.